and get to talk through where we are at and get have some demos of things, but also try and leave some space for questions and discussion towards the end. So if I recall correctly, it's me first for sort of 10 to 15 minutes doing a walkthrough of the change discovery and the overall patterns for how we see discovery working in the IIIF context, and then content state, and then demos and sort of next steps. So at which point I shall share my screen. Which I apologize, takes a little bit of time. I have at the moment still a relatively old laptop, which shares its main memory between video and processing. So starting things is painful. Okay, so discovery overview. So today, and I should probably put scare quotes around today as well at this point, given that we've been moving along pretty well. The way that IIIF viewers find IIIF content is by being told exactly where to go. You need the URI of the manifest in order to see it in a viewer, which for pretty much everyone's, or from everyone's perspective, is a terrible state of affairs. And that is why we started up the Discovery TSG. So the TSG has two main areas of work. The first one is crawling and harvesting of IIIF resources, or essentially, what can we do that's better than just OAI PMH? And the second one is how do we communicate the resources once they've been discovered to applications, be that a viewer or any other sort of IIIF aware application? Or how can we use our preferred viewer rather than the one that a website has configured for you? We have a charter, the link is there, which also talks about some of the other things, including notifications, which we'll talk about later. So the question really is, how do we get from the IIIF content publisher over to the viewer, such that the viewer can find the manifest without being told where it is? The step one for this is essentially that the content publishers will also, along with publishing the manifests, will publish a collection of activities. And those activities could be create, update, delete for the manifests, but also things like move or add or remove from a collection. Each activity then also has a date time at which it is published or at which it occurred, so that you can then know when things happened and whether you've processed that as a search engine, which we'll get to in a minute. The activity then refers to a manifest or a IIIF collection, so that you know that this is something in the IIIF space. But we've already seen some institutions using this pattern for things other than IIIF, and it works just the same. So this, in a nutshell, is the Change Discovery API, which is currently at 0.9 and about to be 0.9.1, which we expect to be the release candidate for 1.0. So we've had maybe 3 or 4 minor things come up with 0.9 that were fixed in 0.9.1. So then what is this AS colon and pages, which I have skipped over? So the collection is an activity streams collection, which is a very simple front page essentially for a set of activities, but that set of activities will be at least one per manifest, and we know that institutions have many manifests. So you wouldn't want to get it all at once. So instead we break it up into pages. It's also the same pattern as the pages for annotations in the presentation API. So it looks like this, and this is directly from the spec. So the collection has a URI where you can fetch it from, example.org activity all changes, a type, the total number of items in it, and then a link to the first and last page. From those pages, which look like this, you can then go back to the collection via part of, and the pages link forwards and backwards to the previous page or the next page. So that's the navigation in a nutshell. They then have an ordered items array, which is cut off at the bottom intentionally, of the activities. And the activities look like this. They have that type, so this is an update. They can have a textual summary, which machines are not expected to do anything with. It's just for people, probably developers, looking at the data. And the main part is the object, which is the reference to the manifest or collection, which was updated in this case. It can also have a see also to a data set, and the end time is the time at which it occurred. So what should a search engine do? Well, first it retrieves the collection. From there, it gets the last page, goes through the activities and retrieves the manifests. However, we don't want to index manifests because manifests are for presentation and not for searching. So the manifest and potentially in the activity can have a see also link over to metadata about the object, and that metadata can conform to a profile such as mods or bibframe or linked art or anything else. Simple double encode, so that the consumer knows what it's getting. So instead, the crawler can index the metadata rather than just the presentation strings from the manifest to produce more semantic search indexes. Exposes that content via a user interface, such that which is not standardized. Any interface will do. But then how do we get from the search user interface, which isn't standardized, over to the viewer? And this is where content state comes in, which we'll talk about in a minute. But essentially, it provides a standardized mechanism of describing the state of the manifest that should be rendered by the viewer as an annotation and a little protocol to get it from the search interface over to the viewer, or a set of protocols really. The viewer then has enough information to go and retrieve the manifest, display it to the user, and everyone is happy. However, there is one outstanding question, which is how do we find the activity streams collection to begin with? There is, as we've seen from the map yesterday, there are many hundreds of IIIF publishing institutions, and we would not want to have to dig around in Google or elsewhere to find all of these activity stream collections. This is where the IIIF Registry comes in, which essentially is exactly the same pattern overlaid on top of the collections, the activity streams collections, rather than on top of the IIIF resources directly. So we can manage this centrally in a relatively lightweight way. Glenn has done some fantastic work to set this up already. So the crawler then can go to the registry and walk through the pages of its collection, each of which refers to an activity stream collection at the publisher's end, and from there go through the pattern that we've already seen to find all of the content. So IIIF C, the home for IIIF, doesn't know about every manifest, but it knows how you can get to the manifests and can point you to them. So then the complete ecosystem looks like this. Crawler can go to the registry, find all of the registered content. It then retrieves the collections of pages, of activities about the manifests. The manifests refer to metadata about the objects, optionally. The crawler can then retrieve the manifests and the metadata to index, produce a search interface, and use the content state to transfer those results of searching over to the viewer to get the manifest, thereby getting in a relatively seamless way from the current state where the viewer needs to know the manifest's identity and location, to an ecosystem in which many different players can cooperate to provide access to IIIF resources. In the opening session, there was some interesting discussion about FAIR principles. So I think this is one of the ways that we can really claim to be F for findable, in that it's not only just it can be discovered in a system, there is an ecosystem of systems which work together to make all of the community's content discoverable en masse. So thank you very much. I think we'll try to leave questions and discussion until the end, because doubtless the next presentations will also answer some of those questions. But do throw them into the chat in case you forget, or write them down so that we can come back to them at the end.
Shall I see if I can share my screen?
Go for it. I think I need to stop sharing first. Okay.
Okay. Can you see slides?
Yep.
Yes. Cool. Right. Okay. I will put it in present mode. Yeah. So content state API is the bit that connects the last two bits of that presentation together, getting from the search result from a discovery system into a viewer. And if you look at the discovery charter, there are 4 parts to it. And one of those parts is called import to viewers, which a few years ago when this was written was the thing that is going to become content state or would lead to content state. Because in the past, we've had this idea of a drag and drop icon, the IIIF icon, you can drop that into a viewer. That's one mechanism for doing this, but there are probably many others. So this idea of getting from a result or a link and then experiencing the object in a viewer is the sort of genesis of content state. But that use case of search results to viewer or drag and drop of an object from one environment to another is just one use case that came up when the discovery work got underway, and from observing the kinds of things people need to do. And you can kind of generalize the problem out quite significantly to be about what am I looking at? I am looking at a view, or I want you to look at a view. How do I give you this view so you can look at the thing I want you to look at? Where I, as the actor in that, might be a search engine, or I might be a human wanting to show you something really cool, or to share a link to some research, or to make a citation of something in a manuscript that I want you to see, or saving my progress in a kind of an annotation task, or all sorts of things that require some representation of the state of the content of a viewer. I think it's important to distinguish that from the state of a viewer itself. So if you can imagine I'm using Mirador, okay, the content state would be, well, I'm looking at a particular zoomed in region of the 37th canvas in this manifest. That's my content state. The viewer state might be, well, I've got this window open and I've got my preferences set to X and Y, and my monitor's 1800 pixels wide or whatever. Those kind of things are the state of the viewer, and they're not the concern of the content state. The content state is pointing at the thing in the object. So, well, this is actually something that viewers do already, and the simplest kind of content state we might want to support is just the address of a manifest. Here is the address of a manifest. I could give you this, and you could probably work out a way of opening that and having a look at it. maybe in Mirador. And most viewers themselves are configurable so that they can initialize themselves from a manifest. You know, I can write a little bit of JSON for Mirador, or write an embed tag for the UV, or do the same kind of thing for any other viewer. And part of that configuration or initialization state on the page would be the address of the thing it's supposed to show. But they don't do that in any sort of standardized way, and they don't do it in a way that accommodates richer use cases like, yeah, I want you to open this manifest, but I want you to then show the fourth canvas and zoom in on the top left. Or I want you to highlight some search terms from this discovery system in the manifest when you open it. Or I want you to open these two videos together, and I want you to move one to 1 minute 37 seconds, and I want you to move the other 32 minute 12 seconds. And I want you to see the comparison between these two scenes of video. These are all content states that we might want to convey and pass around in software. So, well, actually, the thing we've just been talking about is something you can do already with the IIIF Presentation API and annotations. They are the language of the space we're talking about. And so here we have our simplest content state annotation, which is an annotation that points at a manifest with the motivation content state, so that pieces of software that encounter it know what you're trying to do with it. So this is our kind of equivalent content state for the URL we were just looking at. But you might think, well, that's a kind of a bit of a verbose package of stuff just to say here is a manifest to open. So we can have alternative forms for our content state, which make it a bit more manageable. We could start by saying, well, depending on how you acquired this, if you acquired this in such a way as it could only be a content state, then maybe you're allowed just to have the body of the target of an inferred content state annotation, or even just the URL of the thing that target is pointing at. So, this kind of simplification and having an inferred content state annotation gets us back to the simple use case of here is a manifest URL for you to open. But as I said, we can do far more complex things than that. So here are some examples again from the spec. That example I just mentioned of opening on a particular canvas, navigating to a particular point in a particular manifest. If I gave a viewer this content state, then it should go and do that thing. It should go and open canvas 7 in object 1 manifest and zoom to those X, Y, width, height coordinates. Or I want you to see this part of an audio, of a video or an audio recording. I want you to start 14.5 seconds in to this canvas. Or I want you to open two things at once. So here, for example, again, in a viewer that could accommodate multiple objects at the same time, here is a content state that says open this manifest on that page and this manifest and this other manifest on this page. And if you're Mirador, for example, you might understand that content state and be able to present those two things at once. So and we could get as complex as you like. We might not want to get as unnecessarily complex because viewers need to understand these things, but they are all expressed in a language viewers already understand, which is web annotations in a IIIF presentation context. And then the last example, which ties it back to the thing we were originally talking about, is the use of a content state as a search result. You can see here I have a link. Maybe I've searched this discovery system that we now have as a result of the Content Discovery API, and I'm searching it for cats, and I've got this one result here which is giving me a link to open a particular page of Alice in Wonderland with the word cat highlighted. And you'll notice here that I'm starting to introduce the notion of how exactly I convey that to the viewer with this IIIF-content query string parameter. And you can see that I'm passing a content state annotation into a viewer in this way, or into some web context. But there's a problem with what we've just been seeing. And in fact, every example I've shown you so far is invalid for a content state apart from the raw URLs. And the reason for that is because they were chunks of JSON. And if we want to pass JSON around as HTTP request parameters, we're probably going to run into a problem. So unless the content state is just a plain URL, it needs to be encoded. And the spec says to base64 URL encode it, so that in the real world, our link to a viewer that opened a particular manifest at a particular page and highlighted that particular word would look like that instead of the raw JSON we just saw. But again, if it was just a link to a manifest, that link would be a lot shorter and cleaner, and it would just be a URL. So yeah, so far in the Content State API, we've just seen stuff done with the presentation API and web annotations, and the addition of just one thing, which is the motivation content state for annotations. And in fact, what the Content State API is really talking about is the different protocols that pieces of software can agree to implement to allow this state to be transferred from one place to the other. And examples of those are query string parameters, post parameters, accepting a content state as a result of a paste. Maybe you emailed it to me, doing a drag and drop operation, as is currently supported by UV and Mirador and others, uploading a file, uploading a content state, and others. There are others in the spec, and there are many, potentially more we could add later, such as the web share API, which is a relatively new feature that might also be a means of systems passing content state around to each other. So there's a few demos here. I could demo the first one. So this is a thing that Glenn produced as a proof of concept ages ago. I won't go through all these, but what I'll do is I'll just do the drag and drop one. If I open viewer 4, so here we are. And if I now, let's just, if I drag this IIIF icon into this window, that drag and drop operation worked. So we're reproducing functionality that's already been implemented, but now it's just one of many protocols, such as appending to a link, or copying and pasting. So if I copy that to the clipboard, open up another viewer, hit Control V, these are all ways in which content state can be passed around. And obviously, there's nothing visual going on in these demos because they're just really verifying that the state can be passed away in the protocol using the protocols that we've identified. But there are some real implementations of this. So I am going to hand over to Richard first, and then Regis to give a couple of real world implementations of content state. And then after that, we'll hand over to Matt for notifications. So if I stop sharing, then Richard can take over.
No, I can't because I'm disabled from participating.
Oh, okay.
Oh, you need to be a co-host. Hang on.
While you're at it, Meg, could you add me to, I'm down as Digera ANB.
Okay, yeah. Hang on, sorry, the list is moving around. Okay. Okay, you should be all set.
Right. Implementing this in the real world, there are two sides really. You need to be able to create the content, and then you need to be able to view the content. So the way that we went about this was to embed a content creation system into one of our viewers. And here we can see a rather random picture of some stars. And in the viewer, we have enabled various operations. Now, viewers expose information about manifests and canvases very easily. So this area of work is relatively simple to do. If we wish to pick one star in particular, we can draw around it, clearing the selection, draw around the bit that we want. We've got some text already there. I don't want that text. Here's my message. And we have the option then just to save the content state in its base 64 encoded form, and then move to the browser. And paste that. We can see that rather long string. Go to it, and we have jumped in the Mirador viewer now into the same book, and the text that I just typed up has been put in. And this really just involved piggybacking on Mirador 2's annotation system and using the annotation system to display. And all that we did was make the annotation box hashed rather than a box, and put it into dotted lines so that it stands out from other annotations, which may of course be already present in the pages you drop into it. This then gives us something that we can move around in, and so on. I was very pleased that we actually then had a practical instance for this. I had an email a few months ago during lockdown from an inquirer asking a very specific question about the place name Blackpool appearing in a description of a very large Latin medieval register of documents, which would in normal situation have been quite difficult to point somebody to. But I was able to answer the question, is this actually Blackpool, the word that's being used in this text, or is this just what you have translated, by sending back a reply with this tiny URL in. And when we load the tiny URL, we see the words Apud le Blackpool, a bit mixture of Latin and Anglo-Norman. It has zoomed in on it, but if we zoom out, we can see that this is actually in a lot of fairly dense Latin, but that has clearly highlighted the bit that was being inquired about. I think that's over to Regis now to show a more sophisticated and up-to-date version.
Thank you, Richard. I'm not sure it's more sophisticated, but anyway, let me share my screen first. Can you see it?
Yes.
Yes.
Recently we implemented basic support for the content state API in the Biblissima portal in production, but it's just a tiny improvement that basically consisted in two things. The first one was to simply change the target of the IIIF logo on the search result pages and on item pages as well. So we just put a content state, IIIF content instead of manifest as the URL parameter, as you can see maybe at the bottom here. So you have IIIF content equal the manifest URL. And so on the item page, you have the same IIIF logo below Mirador viewer. So you have this tiny info box that explains what you can do with this logo, basically. And you can see the same URL below with the IIIF content parameter. And the other thing that we've done was to generate a content state annotation for illuminated folios, because on the Biblissima portal, as you may know, we also have illuminations indexed into the as part of the data. So here we have a manifest URL and the canvas URL. So this data is encoded as a IIIF content state in base 64 URL. So instead of having a manifest and canvas parameters in the URL, you have a IIIF content with this string here at the bottom, as you can see, behind the IIIF logo, which represent the content states. So on the illumination page, there is the same principle, the same IIIF logo with the encoded content state. And you can, of course, drag and drop this in Mirador, so that the second thing that we've done on the client side. We just customize a little bit Mirador 3 to make it aware of the IIIF content state parameter, and also make it able to decode the content state annotations so that it can open a view like this with a particular manifest out a particular canvas within it. So this instance is the one that has some basic content state support, but it's just 20 lines of code, and it's more like a hack at this point. There is no test for this, and I did not dare to submit a pull request for this. And also, I'm not sure whether the content state support should be part of the Mirador code core or implemented as a plugin. So I just left it like this because this was just made for a workshop I gave in November. But yes, on a longer term, it would be desirable to have full support of content state API within Mirador 3. And also just a final word to say that in the Biblissima portal, on a longer term, what we would like to do would be to rely on the content state, on content state annotations and protocol to handle the creation and the persistent storage of IIIF viewing sessions within Mirador. So because we have a Mirador instance where you can import and make your selection of objects and create your own viewing session with several manifests. So we would like it to support, to rely on the content state to save the viewing sessions. So to rely on a standard way to save this content state persistently.
Cool, awesome. Matt, can you take over the screen for your bit?
Yes, I can. Hopefully, let me give it a go. Can you see my presentation? Yeah. So, and apologies if I'm looking away because it's on the other screen. So, yeah, I'm going to talk very, very briefly about notifications, which is something that hasn't really been covered in a huge amount of depth in any of the working group meetings to date, in the TSG meetings to date. So I think I'm going to kind of try and attract attention to this issue with a view to us working on it in future. So the TSG charter, as Tom mentioned on his previous presentation, has kind of 4 elements in it. The third of these is listed there as change notification, and this is kind of distinct from the change discovery API that Rob was talking about earlier. But basically, this is the idea that how do you kind of identify changes that happen in a kind of atomic way, you know, rather than crawling some endpoints. How do you do various kinds of notification interaction where you might notify some system that something has changed, or kind of keep content up to date between different systems and so on. And there's a kind of a set of anticipated deliverables that are suggested here. So one is just this kind of specification for what those notification interactions might look like. The other is kind of reference implementations for the generators and consumers, validation services, and so on. So I've listed these here. And in the charter, this is largely focused, I guess, on the kind of crawling and harvesting use cases. But these deliverables, the spec for notification interactions, patterns and reference implementations for generation and consumption of notifications, validation, and so on, can potentially support quite a few other use cases. And there's a link here that will take you to the current set of Discovery notification related use cases that are in the IIIF Stories Git repository. So I'm going to kind of summarize these on the next 2 slides, but there's a lot more detail about these in Git. There's been some prior work in this space. So Jeff Witt, for example, through kind of various iterations of things that he's been working on, has been using things like web mention and linked data for notifications and so on. There's been Rerum Inbox with Patrick Cuba and others at SLU, working with Jeff Witt. Raphael Schwemmer did some work on e-codices and so on. So there's been some work in this space, but there hasn't really been a kind of standard IIIF way to do this. So just kind of summarizing the kind of notification patterns. I mean, there's 2 basic patterns that are common here. One is where some third party wants to notify the kind of host or the owner of some content that new content exists. The other is the kind of the other way around, where you are the host or the owner of some content and you want to know when third parties create some new content about your thing. And the third parties here might be an individual user or a scholar, but it might be some crowdsourcing or machine learning platform, some institutional repository, some other service, and so on. So there's no assumption here that it's a single person that's at one end of these patterns. In the kind of use cases, if you kind of try and think about them in a slightly more abstract way, there's kind of a couple of basic things that come up a lot in the various examples that Jeff Witt and others have worked on and that are found in the IIIF Stories repository. It's things like, I've transcribed resource X and I want to announce this fact, or I've added commentary or annotations to this resource, or I have an annotation list of annotations about this resource. Maybe I've created a table of contents or some other supplemental material for that resource. Maybe I've indexed or processed that content and created some new service for it. Maybe a search within service or some machine learning face recognition thing, or whatever it might be that you've done with that content. Or perhaps I think this use case has come out of the maps group. I might have geocoded or georeferenced some resource and I want to announce that. So, all of these involve the creation of some content about a thing, but also then the kind of advertisement or announcement of that content. And then in quite a lot of the use cases, there's this idea potentially that might then involve the kind of incorporation and integration of that content, either by the host institution. I've found some scholars done some interesting work on my thing, so I'm going to bring that in and deliver that at delivery time, or by third parties. And this is a kind of example that I think the kind of Rerum Inbox use cases have, where I load a manifest from institution A, but I discover through my kind of notification system that there is content about that thing somewhere else. So there's this kind of pattern of notification, announcement, integration of content. So these are all the kind of use cases, but there hasn't really been a huge amount of work by the spec group to date yet on this. So I guess the next steps might be to review and supplement these use cases, begin work towards the deliverables that we described on the earlier slides, and I guess a call for participation. So, anyone who's interested is very welcome to join the bi-weekly calls and begin the process of working towards kind of solutions for these things. So please get involved and join in. I think that's all from me on that one.
Great, thank you,
I need to stop sharing my screen.
Matt and Tom and everyone. So we have 20 minutes for questions and discussion. If you want to throw questions into the chat or just wave your hand, put your hand up in the UI, be great. There was some discussion about including content state in Mirador 3. I see that we have Chris and Jack here as well. So Chris or Jack, if you have audio, what would be the appropriate timing and the best way to discuss how to best integrate content state into Mirador 3?
No, I think this is good to see all the examples and kind of the approaches that have been taken thus far. I think there's been concerns around the kind of stability of this. And then with Mirador now being semantically versioned, integrating something that was in progress in core and then having to rewind or retract that. And so we, you know, I think there's also some initial concern around doing anything with the URL state in a browser. So how kind of UV does fragment-based, you know, canvas or manifest linking. Mirador wanted to stay agnostic around browser URL things, and was kind of looking at that as kind of a you know, kind of like Regis seemed to do, a minimal kind of wrapper to initialize Mirador in a from a content state port content state JSON annotation. I definitely think there's so Mirador right now kind of has an internal state that's exportable as JSON and then re-importable to kind of, you know, initialize a Mirador. I could see a serialization of that in a content state compatible like JSON. You know, that would maybe be the first approach. And then kind of the re-import of that maybe is the kind of full cycle of that. So, I mean, if content state is in a place where we're going, to, you know, we're going to be able to go forward with what's there, I think, you know, I think that import export is probably the first likely candidate for implementing.
Yeah, it's important to note that content state is only 0.3 at the moment. So as you've seen, there's some implementations that work and, you know, demonstrably in production. So that's a very good sign. But yeah, there's still some more work to be done on content state before it's finished.
I would agree with what Jack said, and I just add, I think the Mirador 3 plugin system is probably good enough, such that you could build a Mirador 3 content state plugin that could handle all that negotiation if there was a group interested in taking that work on.
Yeah, that sounds sensible to me. I mean, you could quite easily produce a kind of shim layer that would produce the same initialization state for Mirador and the UV out of a content state. That would be a kind of precursor. But yeah, but also the fact that content state is just pure presentation API and annotations, and Mirador can capture an annotation, means that the kind of export of the current view should be, you know, it's almost, you know, just make an annotation of what you're looking at, and that's your content state. Stick a content state motivation on it, and job done.
And Robert Kestis.
Yeah, I'm really happy to see all this. I mean, partly because there's use cases, or at least we've been asked by the scholars and others to have features like this already for 20 years. So to say, we've done that. DigiLib has made it one of the principles to always encode its full state in the URL already since 2001. So you could just in the same way, just take the URL and use it as state and send it to someone and they would see the same, which at the same time limited the possibility of developing new stuff because you had to stick the full state into the URL. So, but the use case remains, so that I see that very validly. And also the question, of course, is now discussing about that and proposing that it should be integrated in Mirador 3. I mean, reading the content state is one thing, but of course the next question is for the user how to create a new content state. And you showed an example which was already quite complicated to have different fields of the different formats, but also the question would be how much of the state of your Mirador do you want to have encoded in the content state? Or are you just saying, well, it's fine, take whatever? Or do you want to say, well, I'm just talking about the page and not about what I have done with 10 other windows at the same time? But then it becomes, of course, difficult for the user, and maybe there should go some user research into that. But yeah, at the same time, as I wrote in the chat, I think now that Mirador 3 is just starting, I think it would be nice to get in early in some way or other, because otherwise, yeah, as you already saw in the past, dragging the little IIIF icon just gave you an URL for the manifest. If now it does something different and some viewer can read it and another can't, it's a more confusing story for the user.
Tom, do you want to talk a little bit about content state versus viewer state?
Yeah, just am I muted? No. Yeah, that notion of kind of conveying the different Mirador windows you might have open, I think that's not the responsibility of the content state. It only points at content rather than describe a particular configuration of a viewer. But that still allows you to say, look at these two things, but Mirador might present that in one way and choose particular windows, and another viewer might choose a completely different way of doing that, or even instantiate two universal viewers side by side, or whatever it needs to do to convey the fact that, you know, I'm telling you about two distinct canvases in two distinct manifests, but I'm not telling you about what my window layout in Mirador looks like. But having said that, it would be, you know, I think we talked about this before, but where the idea that, you know, by keeping the content state just pure IIIF presentation API, you know, you could pass a content state and a viewer state that was Mirador specific around. You could still, you know, that kind of non-spec stuff could still happen if you had an environment in which that was significant, like kind of maybe a teaching environment. But the content state itself is just pointing at the IIIF space and not software space, if you see what I mean. Actually, I'll just address one other issue there. So the spec makes sure that, you know, a single manifest URL is still a valid content state. So in that respect, many viewers already implement the content state API. It's where it goes beyond that and how kind of verbose it gets. You know, the kind of downside of conveying complex states is that they are long strings and they don't look very pretty. You know, the UV does that with a set of hash parameters, but it does it with kind of positional indexes like, you know, canvas 15, etc., which is nice and compact and easy to hack, but is not necessarily persistent, because, you know, the 15th canvas of the fourth collection, sorry, the fourth manifest in the fifth collection, etc., it could be highly unstable as an identifier, whereas the content state is as stable as it possibly can be for the content. And in fact, when it's condensed into the base64 URL, it's not going to be any longer, but it's lost its hackability, which is, I guess, a downside of having to of doing that.
Any further questions or comments, discussion?
I'm just wondering what's missing to get to version 1 of the content state API.
That, Regis, is an excellent question. So, putting my process hat on, we would need to identify the features of the spec and demonstrate that there's at least a couple of implementations, or 2 producers and 1 consumer, which I think we can already do for a large number of the features, even just what we've seen on the call today. There is also some tidying up of the spec. 0.3 is only pretty recent. So there's some additional editorial work. But yeah, if there's any features that we should include, it would be good to get use cases for them sooner rather than later. And perhaps there's this pattern about extensions that we can use for carrying viewer states alongside the content state, and maybe a recipe for how that would work or something like that. David, you have a question in the chat.
Yeah, we've been playing around quite a bit with the activity stream pattern, both for IIIF and for other data sets that we have. And one of the things that we've realized is it works really well for, sort of when you publish and then it goes out, but as you mutate resources, and a lot of our data sets get mutated pretty regularly, even if it is just adding a new field, say, to the metadata, what ends up happening is that activity stream gets exceptionally long. And I think one of ours right now is in the 150,000 pages of 500 records per line. And the crawling of that becomes really difficult. Do we have or want any patterns for dealing with that issue?
Another excellent question. I don't think we have any pattern at the moment. For one of the things that we've sort of discussed in the TSG is when to sort of stop publishing activities, or so that you can't see all of the previous activities about every object, only the most recent activity, which fulfills most of the use cases, if not absolutely all of them. So the majority of the use cases is tell me when something most recently changed, rather than tell me every time the thing changed. So yeah, one way was only, if you have lots and lots of objects with lots of changes, only publish the most recent change per object. Another issue around bootstrapping is the initial crawling is really expensive, because there's hundreds of thousands of requests to get the hundreds of thousands of manifests, and whether we need a reference to some dump file of here is the baseline, and from this baseline we will publish changes, which is part of resource sync, which was one of the sort of input syntaxes, but we haven't gone there yet in the Discovery TSG. But yes, if no one else had said anything, I was going to call on you anyway to talk about the work that you guys have done at Getty. So yes, great to hear about the challenge.
The other thought, just to throw out, that we've found, because we've been trying to figure out how we solve this, is often it's useful just to have a pointer to start from here in the activity stream. Because what we've seen, the pattern that we've seen most regularly is we add a new field, say, to the metadata block. And then we reprocess all of the content. And so everything past that is good for historical preference, and because it's immutable and we don't want to mess up that, like the the whole premise of activity stream is that it's this, immutable list of things you've been going from. But being able to say, if you start at page 9,000 and go forward, you won't miss any content updates, which is lighter than doing the dump.
So a first page of 0, but a first useful page of 6,000. Yep. Yes, we should make some issues to discuss this in the TSG. Right. Looking at the time, are there any other questions or comments?
Just a quick question. I really like the idea of the integrating additional material through the API. And I wanted to ask, are there already patterns for the different kinds of stuff that there could be? Because we have some very concrete use cases where people start transcribing text and marking up images in old folios and are just at the point of that discussion. How do you integrate that? Do you create manifests out of the other manifests? How do you keep the old Canvas IDs? Do you have to, can you, and such things? So it would be really interesting to hear people that are active in that field.
Yeah, we haven't talked much about the sort of supplemental content part that sort of came under the notification healing that we haven't worked on as much. But given that you mentioned I have use cases ... it would be great to get those use cases so we can talk about them. And I think someone threw the link to the discovery use cases into the chat. Or
yeah, Julianne put it in.
Thank you, Julianne.
Yeah.
But yes, no, we haven't really discussed the sort of extensions yet, certainly for content state.
Yeah, I mean, there have been people who've been doing this with various kind of approaches to it, but nothing that's been kind of developed as part of the spec group at the moment.
Oh, Josh, it's the top of the hour, so I will hand back to you.
Well, great. I think the only thing to say is just thanks all for joining. This is a great crew. Hopefully, part of the idea here was to spread the word on these important improvements and some good discussion here. So the next step is if you're able to join, there's kind of a companion group, the Discovery for Humans group, that has a session starting in 30 minutes from now, whatever that is in your local time. And that it's kind of a related effort looking more from the user experience side. So there's a good workshop happening then. If you can join us, this is the same URL. We'll put up a placeholder slide, but otherwise, yeah, we'll take a half-hour break and reconvene. And thanks again for joining us.